feel like Kobe in the fourth quarter.
This is the Dane Moore NBA podcast coming a Thursday evening. It's September 21st, and the pod is back. A quick reminder that this episode and all episodes this season will also be available on YouTube. So if you're listening on your podcast player right now, want to jump on YouTube, you can go over there. We'll, not so much for this episode, but over the course of the year, be mixing in video clips of what the players maybe say at media availabilities, do some X's and O's. We can show like stat stuff up on the screen. So if you're looking to add that in, by all means, jump over to YouTube. If not, the podcast stays the same in podcast version there. But if you are going to watch on YouTube or if you want to check it out, please go over there. It's youtube.com/@DaneMoreNBA. If you hit subscribe, that helps us get into the YouTube algorithm. As I understand it, just search the Dane Moore NBA podcast on YouTube. You should be able to find it. Anyway, this episode and the pod kind of being back, we're a week away from Media Day. I think this episode kind of kicks off our training camp sort of coverage. Obviously doing that with Britt today, and then we'll kind of ramp up as Media Day gets here. But Britt, I'm just really excited to start with this episode. We've been doing this, trying to think, maybe 2, 3, 4 years. We do an episode after you interview the coach. It's kind of an annual tradition for a long time for you that you do a one-on-one interview. We'll get into it. This one I found particularly informative. They always are. It's kind of like the breadcrumbs to start the season. But what's kind of the story behind you wanting to do these interviews, and why do you continue to do them every year?
Well, I guess it began with Flip Saunders because, Flip Saunders in many ways in terms of basketball knowledge was a mentor of mine. I started covering the team, what was it, in 89, I think it was. And so I would have been 36. But I didn't know basketball nearly. I mean, I liked the game, but I didn't know the game. And Flip would just gleefully talk to me, as many other beat writers will tell you. I'm not the only person he did this with. But it got to the point where I think I got ingested enough of the way he thought about basketball to be confident enough to say, hey, do you want to do a Q&A or something? And then when I did a profile on Kevin McHale for Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine, or maybe it was City Pages, I can't remember which, but in any case, that was another back and forth long interview where I began to feel like, I can dig into stuff with these people and not only learn more for myself, but just throw it out there. And so I did it with Flip a couple of times, and then Flip died suddenly and Sam Mitchell became coach. And Sam was taking a lot of heat for not being smart enough and all the other things. And he and I had a dust up after a game where he kind of belittled me, and there was a growing pushback from the media folks and the fans. And there's a good friend, mutual friend of both Sam and me, that said, you guys are both good guys. You want to have the thing you did with Flip, do it with Sam. And that worked out really well because Sam had an axe to grind and wanted to show everybody how smart he was.
I remember that. I remember that one. That's the first one I ever read. Like before that, I guess I didn't know about you, or I wasn't knowing that this was a thing. So when I think of this, the Britt and Coach interview, that's the first one. I think it was so
that was actually one of the most notorious because Sam is such a prickly guy anyway. And he can't help. I mean, I covered him for years as a player in the locker room, and he was like this with his teammates. He's a combative guy, and it's mostly in fun. But if you assume it's all in fun, you're going to get in trouble. Right. So it is this kind of interesting line you walk with him. But he was very satisfied with the way it turned out. And Bob Hummel, the guy who kind of got us together, said he was really pleased, and Bob was pleased. Everybody liked it. So then I began to
with Robbie,
not to be confused with Robbie. Right? Bob Hummel it seems to be an incredibly common name, which is interesting to me, at least in basketball circles. Yeah. But so anyway, I began to think, well, this can go beyond, Flip, and I can do this with Sam. And then I did 2 years with Tibbs, his 2 years here, and that obviously, Tibbs is a wet blanket on any kind of divulging of anything. Those were probably the low points of these. And then I don't think I did Ryan. Anyway, what happened eventually was that I got Finch. This is my 3rd year with Finch. And we just connect very well. I get more edified with Finch than with anybody. Part of it is my confidence and my knowledge is strengthened. Part of it is that I think he and I are similar in many ways as people. But for whatever reason, I just think it works well, and I always look forward to it. And most of the time it's between 45 minutes and an hour. And this year, I didn't look at the clock. I just basically talked and assumed somewhere between 45 minutes and 60 minutes. And I didn't know how, my tape recorder, I have one of these old-fashioned tape recorders, surprise, surprise, that doesn't have the time immediately clocked on it. So by the time I was finished, I looked down and it was an hour 23. So, it was a long-ass conversation.
And the conversation, we should say, that's what this article is. It's a transcription of
transcription, right? A brief intro, and I'll clean up a little of it. The first part is always the hardest. The first part is up today. It's always the hardest because you're trying to establish the rapport, but also you have to identify all the players for casual readers. I mean, MinnPost is kind of a general interest publication. It's not a sports publication, and I kind of like it that way, to be honest with you. But so there's all these parentheses to some extent of, providing context. Like when he talks about 4s and 5s, those are power forwards and centers, or talks about drop or being up or switching or, all this lingo. But we settled into it, and I think MinnPost thinks there's going to be 4 parts. I think there's going to be 5, but I'm just following their dictates. They don't want it to be over 2,000 words. I went through a war with them on that last year, and I just conceded it this year. But now, it's going to be interesting to see how all that happens. But anyway, I'm really happy with what came out. I think it's a particularly interesting season in that they were 42-40, and everybody was kind of disappointed. I think that's a great place to start,
right?
With any season,
Yeah, I think that's why for me, I don't know. I was just kind of, training camp's around the corner, and in my head, I've been kind of checked out from the Wolves for a while, as I think we all have. This conversation, or just reading even this first piece, it's about the KAT and Gobert pairing, which is in general why I think I've checked out so much from the Wolves. Is I feel like that we've just beat the hell out of that, you know. But what I appreciate about this conversation with Finch is it's about what happens next, right? It's not just, I don't know. He suggests practical steps going forward. He admits imperfection. And in that, at least for me, that's where this becomes interesting to me. That's where the nuance of all this is okay, we know that there were good things and there were bad things, probably more bad things than good things, right? But how much do we weigh those? What can change? How long are certain things going to change? I thought he did a really good job of that throughout the interview, of being like, some of these things are going to take a while, maybe even like up to half of a season, or that's what they thought last year going into it. So I really appreciated the way that Finch was willing to open up, and I think you did a good job of peeling the layers back a little bit. But let's just jump into it with the pair pairing. There, obviously, you ask about that, and I thought his response to it, the first thing that stood out was he said, "Well, to me, it starts with a very important question: what does a big team look like in the modern game?" And he strikes me as somebody who's actually had significant time to think about that now, right? With having practical information, film, stats, understanding personalities more. He knew that was the question 12 months ago. I don't think he had the information to be able to answer it. Obviously complicated by the injuries and training camp last year, yada, yada, yada. But he strikes me as someone who has some ideas here now, which obviously we hope, but some real things that he and his staff are digging into and are ready to kind of put into place in training camp. What about that stood out to you most, and the way he described making the bigs work? Because I have something for me, and I'm curious from your standpoint.
Yeah, I think what I came away from last year is he was overconfident that this was going to work well. Right. I mean, he says now it was going to take 50 games, but I remember he'll never get around the word seamless when it comes to me. If that Gobert press conference, we said it's a seamless fit. And that was clearly not the case. And I don't know whether he was trying to bullshit us or himself, but essentially it wasn't going to be seamless. He concedes that now. What struck me was one of the lines that struck me was we spent a lot of time having Rudy teach us the kind of player he could be when he was in Utah and structuring that. But now it was almost like we conceded more to Rudy than Rudy conceded to our system last year. And that's going to tilt back a little bit now. As you know, I mean, and he, you know, first of all, I should mention that parts 1 through 4 or 1 through 5 or whatever it is, he staunchly defends Gobert. When I pushed back in the right near the end of the interview and pretty much just suggested that the Wolves might have been better off without the trade, period, he pushed back pretty hard on that. So he clearly is, as to be expected, he's in Gobert's corner. But he did say, you know, it is time to do things differently than he is used to doing them. They built that team around him for all 9 years he was there. And so that's what I saw. I saw you can't play drop all the time. You have to do a lot more different looks on defense because that's how you get played off the floor in the playoffs. And on offense, you can't just be looking to play spread pick and roll. You can't be looking to set screens for everybody regardless. I mean, what he would say is on secondary action, what Rudy does automatically, if the first action breaks down, he is looking where the ball goes and goes and chases the ball to set up a pick and roll. Well, anybody who knows anything about Finch's offense, first of all, he's not a pick and roll oriented guy. Secondly, he likes ball movement, not pick and roll, in terms of that kind of player rub off thing. That he'll have that in his arsenal, but that's really not his thing. So I think the idea that Rudy is going to be brought to bear a little bit more to conform with what the Wolves did the year before he got here, and that we may have a better blend of what Rudy can do best, which I think was the learning curve last year, and what the Wolves can do best with Rudy, which I think is the learning curve this year. I think that is what struck me about that part.
It, to me, was the dichotomy of what Rudy needing to adjust to them some, which actually is asking Rudy to be more flexible, going in that direction. But the rest of the roster needs to be more structured to accommodate for Rudy.
That's
and
right.
And Finch lays that out probably more eloquently than I can. That's an interesting collision, right?
Yes.
And you know, we talked at length about structure last season, what the opportunity cost of that would be. I think we both got to the point eventually last season where it seemed to us that structure would benefit this group. And I think Finch saw that too. Obviously, he's seen everything we are times 10, but they struggled to implement some of that structure, given not only the absence of KAT, but the interchange of the roster, D'Lo, other injuries along the course of the season. I mean, last year was kind of like 3-4 separate seasons in terms of roster construction altogether. But Finch is viewing this now per the interview, that structure is necessary for the group. Flexibility is necessary from Rudy, but also, which was kind of like the first, not like red flag, but this inserting structure, he seems to want to do a ton when the two bigs are on there, but lean back into free flowing some when it's only one of the two bigs in the lineup. And I think, right, isolated to each of those three vacuums, double bigs, just KAT, just Rudy, you would probably want different things for all three of those. But how does that sort itself out? I mean, those are significant switches in the course of a quarter of one game. You might touch all three of those buckets in a given quarter. It's going to take real discipline from the group to be able to recognize and know that what is going on. That was obviously an ailing point of the team last year, an inability to do that consistently. But it's on the coaching staff. And I think they are more in tune to the idea today, September 21st of 2023, that they need that than they were September 21st of 2022. And the thought is here, right, over the next month before they play a game, so much of this is hammered home, and developing a more structured offense or more structured team by having structure day to day in training camp of what exactly this looks like. I think it's all a good idea. It's how I would do it. I just read this and think about it. I think that it's going to have its growing pains. Those things are going to take a while.
And I do think one of the ways that gets hastened is that Finch said things like, that's on me.
Yeah.
I did not have, anybody who knows anything about Chris Finch knows he loves to let the people determine the game. When I first interviewed him and asked him what kind of a coach he was way back in our first interview, he said he's the kind of person that rather than imposing play calls, he wants to watch his players interact with each other, and what they do best forms his play calling. He wants the freedom to flow into structure. And he flat out said this time, that has to be reversed this year. We have to put the structure in first, and then maybe we will flow that out into freedom. So I think that the emphasis will be not lost on anybody in that training camp. And what's interesting is you got guys like Kyle Anderson, Mike Conley, Rudy Gobert now, who are three of the top 6 or 7 right there, who are used to this. Lack of structure is the outlier. So it's on KAT and Ant, not two inconsiderable parts, by the way, but they are the ones that are going to have to make the changes to some extent. And what Finch does say is that the deal I'm kind of making with Rudy and KAT is they have their little 2-man game that they have to sort out all the nuances in transition, who goes low, who stays high, who posts up, who goes to the other side, who's in the action, who's on the opposite end of the court, all that stuff. But he says 2 things also need to happen. If those 2 take care of their business, he'll take care of the other 3 people on the court. But he also said, but all this has to be in the context of Anthony Edwards being our dominant player and being the guy who stirs the drink. It would be crazy for him not to say that, given what everybody knows by now, which is that, you can try to resist it all you want, but this is Ant's team, And so what I appreciated was the admission of why his attitude, his natural inclination to coach a certain way, was not an effective match with the personnel he had last year to some extent, and that he needs to change some. I also think he stressed when I talked about structure, and I started to talk about, structure. He said, well, we're not going to be a robotic pattern team. What we're going to do is lessen the number of sets that we generally run, because those sets are going to be able to establish secondary spacing when things, most times, let's face it, I'd say if you if your play calls are executed successfully with no redo or offensive rebound or whatever, 40-50% of the time, you have a humming offense.
Yeah.
And so most of what he's trying to do now is set this team up to flow into a structured flow rather than running around like a chicken with your head cut off, and being able, like, Rudy isn't automatically going to go down into the dunker spot all the time, I don't think, but he is going to be in the dunker spot because of this secondary action. He doesn't want Rudy setting as many high pick and rolls all the time because, let's face it, the team, just wasn't that way.
Well, the structure is about spacing. That's what it's about.
Exactly.
And you want structure not to become robotic. You want spacing. At the end of the day, that's, I think, the number one thing everyone learned is that for this to work, spacing it's the key, right? And I think, somewhat naively, the hope is that you could just find that naturally through the flow. The structure is what creates spacing here, and he gets into KAT specifically with how he's kind of the fulcrum of that. But the goal is spacing, structure getting you there. Over the course of time, can you pull back structure while keeping the spacing? Flow and space is the dream, but to get there needs to be structure in the first place. So I want to talk about the KAT part of it specifically because
Sure.
I find that interesting. But I do want to first talk about how we are going to be doing Wolves Fest at Falling Knife this October 14th. It's going to be just kind of like a Wolves Brewery Day at Falling Knife, kind of late afternoon, 4 p.m. People start coming. Britt and I, maybe some others, are going to do a show at 5 o'clock. We did this last year. Hang out. We'll do a show, and then the Wolves play a preseason game that night. They play the Knicks at 6:30. So after the show, we'll watch the game there. They have the screens and everything to be able to watch the game. I just wanted to get that on everyone's radar, and just the general idea that if you're trying to watch Wolves games someplace in Minneapolis this year, Falling Knife is a place to do that. And I think, Britt and I both enjoyed doing live shows over the course of the year there last season. And I think it's kind of the perfect way to sort of kick off this season as well. So keep that on your calendars, October 14th, coming at like 4 o'clock. Britt, I know you're getting there like kind of right at 5. We'll do a show kind of leading up to the game time. Not, we don't have as much structure as the Wolves office. But,
and with Falling Knife, it's a great beer. So, yes. It would be a horrible thing if the brewery that loves the Timberwolves and wants to host the Timberwolves all the time had mediocre beer.
Right.
It really would, because, I'd just be mum about it. All right. Yeah, that's where we're going.
All right, let's get back to talking about
KAT. Yeah.
KAT and offensively this structure. I mean, you're gonna be drunk if you're taking a sip of your drink every time we say structure here, but it's ultimately what it is, Britt, right? It's in the times this summer that I've gone back to watch anything, particularly anytime the Wolves had all three of KAT, Rudy, and Ant on the floor together. It's this crazy juxtaposition of terrible spacing, and it looks like a disaster, but then a possession later, the spacing is there, and it looks really freaking hard to guard. And what I found interesting from your interview with Finch, you kind of mentioned it when he came on my show a couple months ago too, is that KAT is the fulcrum of that. There needs to be a specific spacing in place for when KAT's playing at the nail, the free throw line, the elbow area kind of extended there. There needs to be a certain type of spacing. If KAT's in the dunker spot, is he above the break at the top of the key there? I know Finch doesn't want to, he said this numerous times, he doesn't want to just plant KAT in the corner, but that's going to happen sometimes too. Those are all completely, KAT can create elite space, and because he's a weapon at every one of those spots. How do the other 4 players react to that, to give KAT the space to be able to be a weapon in all 4 of those spots? Man, we could go through for one of those spots and be like, this is when it's worked great when KAT's in the post. This is when it's been a disaster when KAT's in the post, at the nail, above the break, whatever it might be. And so much of that is teammate dependent. And I really do think that, in my opinion, is totally the right place for Finch to be approaching his focus, or the group's focus offensively, in terms of what the structure of this offense looks like. Again, though, I will say complicated. That's going to be complicated to have. I mean, players' awareness is going to need to be at a significantly higher level than it was last season. It's going to naturally be at a higher level due to some continuity.
Right.
But I'm fascinated to track that, as even in the preseason.
And I think, again, the more I thought about it during the offseason, the more that D'Lo trade was one of the best deals that ever happened in Timberwolves history. I mean, and I am not a D'Lo fan, as everybody knows, but I am not talking about the absence of D'Lo as the reason why it was such a great trade. I'm talking about the fact that Mike Conley and Nickeil Alexander-Walker are absolutely perfect pieces for exactly what you're talking about. Mike Conley can do whatever needs to be done. I mean, he's been in the league like 16, 17 years. He's played for a franchise. You want to talk about structure and grit and grime. The Grizzlies were, they did things a certain way all the time. And he was a scorer sometimes in that system, a feeder sometimes in that system, and sometimes he just got out of the way. And he's used to all 3 of those roles. He's used to all 3 of those roles. Same thing in Utah. Exactly. And I don't know where this is in the Finch interview, but we were talking about the fact that after about 6 games, when Conley came to the Wolves, Finch went to Conley and said, hey, listen, when our offense worked a lot better when D'Lo was in the slot and getting shots from outside, and Ant and D'Lo were both scoring from outside, we need you to do a little bit more scoring. Well, lo and behold, you can almost chart it on the game logs of what happened with Conley just began to, rack up the points. He shot better than 42. He led the Wolves in 3-point shooting. He registered the best points per play as a pick and roll ball handler of anybody in the league, with over 3 possessions when he came over to the Wolves. And more to the point, it doesn't really matter what type of structure you want. Conley understands what you want and will help impose that structure. And he's got Ant's ear. Ant loves Conley. If anybody who sees these 2 guys in the locker room knows that Ant is constantly asking Conley questions and regards him, properly so, as some kind of, wise man. And so that's going to really help, because Ant's going to really have to understand that when KAT goes off, it ultimately is to his benefit, because that does create the gravity that does give Ant the space that he wasn't getting a lot of the times last year. So you have that. And then you have Gobert needs to be more disciplined. If Gobert is out setting screens when KAT is out there, that is a clog. Whereas if Gobert plays like Vando did the year before Gobert arrived and just cuts in from the dunker spot or whatever, that's a good thing. And then, and again, this is another thing that occurs later in a to be published part of the Finch interview. Jaden McDaniels was superb in a 2-man game with KAT, cutting off KAT's. When KAT is at the elbow or the high block or whatever, McDaniels cutting. Finch said, got to the point when KAT first got hurt where McDaniels was kind of lost for a period of a week or 2, not knowing how to move without the ball the way he used to before. So the potential, as you say, it is going to be complicated. It's especially going to be complicated because Rudy, KAT, and Ant are alpha-oriented players. They have grown up, all of them have grown up thinking that sooner or later, if not now, they are the best players on the court. So that is
Mike
where
ties
this
into that. Mike, I loved how he tied Mike into that, where he was like, yes, Ant and KAT are high usage players, and D'Lo was as well prior to the trade. Just that's statement of fact, right?
Right.
Rudy isn't as much statistically in terms of possessions used, but the way in which he plays is a higher usage sort of way because it's such a demanding action. It's so scripted, so structured. Basically, every possession Rudy uses. So I really liked how Finch said that. It kind of became 4 really high usage players, which not even getting Jaden. Like, then Jaden's your 5th, and I think we're trying to find ways to get Jaden more usage. But what happened with Mike was, or what Finch said was that it made that Rudy's weird nature of his usage fall into line a little bit better. So so in theory, we have tape from the post. I mean, it's kind of those last 3 games of the regular season or whatever, plus the playoff series against Denver, where you go, okay, KAT's going to have his usage, Ant is going to have his usage, and we kind of trust Mike and Rudy to balance that third piece of the pie, effectively finding him, and Mike needing to effectively find his scoring too, because D'Lo proved that was a valuable thing as well.
And I think the salient point here in that regard is the dominant image I have of D'Lo is cat and mouse in the mid-range, dribbling the ball and staring at his man. And he made good things happen out of that. I mean, he got a lot of rip-through fouls, he got a lot of nice bankers, and he got a lot of dimes out of all that stuff. But those are time-consuming things. Mike Conley gets to what's happening almost right away. Mike Conley does not play cat and mouse. What he basically does is he gets off the ball if he doesn't see anything on the ball. If he's on the ball, he'll make the play that furthers something purposefully. If it's not a purposeful furthering of the offense, it's a purposeful reorienting of the offense so someone else is in the best place to further the offense. It is a surprisingly egoless game in that, all right, I mean, this isn't for me right now, boom. Or this is the way this is for me right now. I'm a scorer, or I'm a passer, or I'm a rebounder. Actually, he's pretty good on offensive rebounds. So the point being, to have a player be such a chameleon for the forces of good on your team, when you have guys who take a lot of air out of the room in the half-court offense, is incredibly necessary for this team, and quite frankly, is one of the reasons why Finch can talk about structure and have it not be as daunting a task as it otherwise would be. I mean, imagine if D'Lo was still on this team and we were talking about these adjustments. It would just be a nightmare.
Well, it's the oxygen idea. I like that. Right. It's like Mike takes smaller breaths of air when he has the ball, right? And he has a little bit more ability to breathe air into the offense.
Right.
Where D'Lo takes bigger breaths of air, and it is probably a better scorer because of it. But again, in the context of this, when you line up the 3 top dogs on this roster, you need more air than you need scoring, right? And we saw it. This is already like, this isn't a theory. It was better in the 29 games that Mike played last season. I think we already know that the fit there is substantially better, but it's not even necessarily about that, because it fit last year. It still wasn't that good. Right. So how do you grow off of that point? And Mike, according to Finch, and I think according to us too, you can see growth through Mike that you wouldn't have been able to maybe see it had that trade not happened.
And as great as Ant is now and will become even greater, he naturally is going to be a somewhat low efficiency player. He's not going to be a guy who gives you a true shooting percentage of 65 or something. he's going to be a Kobe-like player in that respect. And to have a guy like Mike around, rather than a guy like D'Lo around, will enable that efficiency to get better and also enable him to do the things he does that don't make greater efficiency for him personally. But the reason Ant is so valuable is because he can do things no one else can do. Everybody on the court is aware of that, and he has that gravity. So when you have two guys that can create gravity, actually three if you want to throw Gobert and the low block in, but if you have that and you have a guy who knows how to utilize spacing, then you could have a very well-hummed offense, one that's really rolling. But again, that structure piece is important because you have these personalities, you have these ingrained habits, and that has already proven that those personalities and those habits, even if there had been more familiarity, I don't think would have really worked in the long run. And so that's why I think it's happening the way it's happening.
I think this is related. I just threw this up on the screen on the YouTube channel. I was looking at this yesterday, and this is related to the Ant efficiency sort of thing, because I think this is the ultimate sort of question is that there is that, whatever you called it, the Kobe nature of Ant.
Right.
How and where can it become more efficient, starting at a level that inherently doesn't really demand efficiency, right? You got into some of this with Finch in terms of foul drawing, in terms of how to more effectively be decisive in pick and roll, how Rudy screening, all these different things. And I just looked this up here. These are the 20 highest volume pick and roll players in the league last season. These are the guys who ran over 1,000 pick and rolls that led to a shot, turnover, or pass that led to a shot. And Ant, you'll see here at 13th in that group, right below Trae Young, right above Ja Morant and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And I was looking at this after having read your piece on it. There are so many things. Let's just say gets better at foul drawing. One. Let's say the spacing gets better. Boom. Like every one of those things that happen, Ant moves up this list in terms of pick and roll efficiency. And we know that pick and roll isn't going to be the main thing. And we say all the time, Finch isn't a super pick and roll guy. Well, Ant ran 1,011 pick and rolls last season.
Right.
It's just an undeniably huge part of the game if that's the way that you're playing, right? And I think that all these things that Finch is talking about in terms of structure and spacing and adjustments and all these sort of things is just going to be a more efficient style of playing. And Ant is not, you're like, oh, he's only 13th out of the 20 guys in efficiency. I kind of think of that of like, nothing was in a really good place last season, and he was 13th despite it. He was more efficient than Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in pick and roll game. So I think it can have the Kobe nature or whatever we want to call it, but also assume that it's going to be significantly more efficient over the course of this season as Finch adds more structure and just overall efficiency to the offense.
And one of the places you just talked about pick and roll, and it is surprising how often he was regarded in pick and roll, but also he's one of the top ISO players. And that is where the lack of drawing fouls really became glaring. And that's, I'm sure, the analytics department with the Wolves clued Finch in on this if he didn't already know it already, and he probably did. But Ant drawing fouls in ISO was like, I'm not sure he even made it into double-digit percentiles. He might have been like 0 to 10. Yeah. It was just, he just doesn't draw the foul in ISO situations. And anybody who watches Ant kind of knows that. He's a wonderful Euro stepper. He's a wonderful athlete, and he utilizes all of that to basically avoid contact because he really does have this supreme belief that he can get to the rim and get around anybody. And
it reminds me of Levine, man. I'm serious. But where it's this elite athleticism that allows you to be explosive in your Euro and without really losing speed and all those sort of things to effectively avoid contact. The difference with Ant is not athleticism compared to Zach LaVine. Those guys are comparable. Maybe even at this point, Ant's a better athlete than LaVine is. But Ant has the physical force of his body to be able to do those things when necessary, but also just go through and effectively draw the contact and get to the line at a significantly higher rate. Like those are things Ant is going to do in his career. What Finch is saying to you is, how do we make that happen game 1? Or how do we make it happen consistently by game 20? You know, because when we're talking about overall, what are the 23rd in offense? I mean, these are, Finch always says we got to grab the low hanging fruit. Like this is Ant getting the line is low hanging fruit here. Spacing is low hanging fruit. There's a lot of it out there.
Yes.
And I think this is right now, knowing what your roster is going to look like, having continuity is the first time if you're Finch or the coaching staff can be like, how do we actually grab this low hanging fruit? Let's do it. Like, let's not just say there's low hanging fruit here. Do it or don't play, or structure the offense, or like, if you can't fit into this, that gets us our low hanging fruit. Like, you're not playing, or we're not playing that way. I get the sense that they're so focused on that in my mind, it just makes me believe that the efficiency is going to improve.
And I also think this is in part 2, where the part 2 focuses a lot on Ant. It'll be out, I would imagine, either tomorrow or over the.
It says Friday on the. It said.
Oh, it does say Friday? Oh, great. Yeah, okay, so it'll be out.
I read that. You sent me that one too. So
okay,
I read parts 1 and 2.
But so anyway, what he said was, we got to simplify. Don't be. The refs don't know if you're switching hands as you're going up, which everybody knows. Ant loves to do that. You know, the old Michael Jordan, they're about to block the shot. All of a sudden he's backing it in with his left hand or whatever. But he said, think of other people. I mentioned Butler. He said, Butler's a perfect example. Yeah. He does things very, very basic and simple so that everybody can see that Jimmy Butler is getting fouled.
But man, I can just picture that, right? Like that is
anybody who saw Butler here, you know, he was brilliant at it, and he's continued that brilliance in Miami.
It's gotten better.
So all you don't need Ant to be Jimmy Butler. It's never going to happen. But what you do want is Ant, when it looks like he's going to get fouled, rather than doing everything in his power to avoid that, accept the fouls, go to the line, make your shots. And I do find it encouraging that we did see some of that in the World Cup. You know, Ant began to realize, get me fouled, you know, I'll get to the line. And I got to tell you, if that happens this year, and don't worry so much about yelling, hey, you know, because I really do. I mean, I know it was a thing and the Wolves fans loved it, you know, glommed onto it, whatever. There are some refs, human nature being what it is, who will be less likely to call a foul if you're calling the foul for them as they're going up. It's like the N1 call. How often does somebody yell N1 and get the N1? I mean, the refs don't want that. So just keep quiet, go up, get fouled, go to the line, and shoot you 75% of the time it goes in. And meanwhile, people will foul you less. You'll have room to use that Euro. You'll have places and times where you'll get the call, even when you maybe shouldn't get the call, the way Butler and a lot of other people do. And even if Ant approaches a normal level, if he's 50th percentile in ISO foul drawing, it's going to be enormous because of how often he does it.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break to this will be an audio version ad break here. We'll be back with Britt in a minute. I just wanted to also say, anybody that, as we had an ad here, anybody that is interested in or looking to advertise their brand or their business on podcast this season, DaneMooreProductions@gmail.com. If you'd like to do that, we'll be back with Britt in a moment in audio version. All right, Britt. We are back here. We're getting into the Ant part a little bit, which was in part 2, which I also read. Will be out on Friday morning. I thought it was interesting how Finch talked about the Rudy and Ant combination, right? That is
over and over again.
what he said was, quote, "We are doubling down on it." Rudy isn't all of a sudden going to become a better post player. The teammate relationship piece is there, though. They both really like each other and understand each other. Ant never played against drop consistently because KAT was setting a majority of his pick and rolls for 2 years. People weren't dropping against KAT. I pegged this right out of the gate last year as a huge growth challenge for us and Anthony. That is a great point. One by
Right.
Finch, of course. We talk all the time, or I talked all the time last season about how Ant hadn't played with a lob threat throughout his career. Prior to Rudy being here at Georgia or even AAU high school like that. He's never had that type of big next to him, which we see more with a more basic set of the ice on the X's and O's of like, he quote unquote can't throw the lob. But what that really is not that Ant can't throw the lob. Ant can and will figure that out. What it was more about was understanding what that coverage is and what drop coverage looks like when you are the guard bearing down on that. When Ant hadn't seen that in his life, particularly in his NBA life, when, I don't know, I mean, prior to Rudy being here, what percentage of the pick and rolls had Ant run with KAT of his pick and rolls? 75% of them.
Right.
The rest of them were mostly Naz. Those are pick and pop guys. Those are guys that most teams are not going to at all feel comfortable with dropping their big back against. And so Ant got downhill in the first 2 years of his career with significantly more ease. When it's Rudy out there setting the screen, the big is always going to drop back because Rudy isn't the threat to pop there. And that presents a different maze to the rim if you're Ant.
One that works against his skill set. Ant does not have a floater.
Boom.
And so that is something that either he will have to learn, or what Finch would like to see is a little bit more patience from both Ant and Rudy, and for all the team for that matter. He talked continually in the first 2 parts in talking about, revamping the offense or retooling the offense, whatever you want to call it, of late in the clock situations. He wants them to not play cat and mouse, but to force decisions and then have the experience and instincts to exploit the decision that is made by the defense. In Ant's case, lacking a floater, what it would be is continuing on the drive, and then everybody, if Ant is driving, they're going to come over and then executing the lob, or then executing some way to get the ball to Rudy, and Rudy being patient enough to know this is a late clock situation. Conley did this very well, by the way. Kyle Anderson does it extremely well. Kyle Anderson,
it's old player game. It's you say put the guy on your ass, right? Like
right.
It's a drop coverage, and you want to keep that rear view contesting guard behind you. I mean, you see Chris Paul is the perfect example of it, right?
Yeah, right.
He gets the screen, he gets about to the nail, and he kind of stops with his dribble, make sure the guard is behind him. Then all of a sudden, the big is at like right in front of the rim. You're at the free throw line. You have this space to be able to pull up, take the floater, or engage the big for the lob. And again, not because he can't do it,
right?
Won't be able to do it. He has done so little of that in his career because he needs reps doing that, and he needs to develop comfort with that whole slowing down action and the idea of stopping force, right? He's such a forceful player getting to the rim, but to be able to occasionally mix that in, a change up, if you will, of the floater or the lob pass right there, that's going to be a complete game changer in the pick and roll too, which again, I think is going to take time. So all these things, but it was close to a 0 last year. And we put those stats up on there, and he is a more efficient pick and roll player than Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was, right? Like these are the things that are going to come in to some extent this season. And I get why Ant isn't good at those, man. I remember talking to Ryan about Ant's rookie year, and it was all new. It's COVID, it's all that. And Ryan was like, force. It just needs to be force. That's the first thing we're gonna focus on with Ant. And it was the go dunk on people once you get going downhill. It's
reminds me of Wiggins in his rookie year's first 2 years is the spin move.
Second year.
Everybody, constantly, Andrew, you got to go to the hoop. And in Golden State, how often does he go to the hoop now?
Right. It's, but that's the difference between Wiggins and Ant, right? Is the hope
40 pounds for one thing.
Well, yeah, but that Ant, when he reaches his prime, is going to be in a completely different role than what Wiggins is in his prime, and what he's asked to do in Golden State. But these are things that can be repped out, right? And these are things that can be learned by Ant through study and through all those sort of like less glamorous things. But like you said, bringing up Conley, teaching him that, I know for a fact these are the things that they've been trying to work on Ant with over the course of the season. But it's not just throwing the lob to Rudy. It's becoming a weapon against drop coverage, which understandably Ant wasn't that good at last year because he had never done it in his career before. So I thought that was awesome that Finch was all over that. It opened up.
And I think it's important to note that when you have guys like Kyle Anderson, Mike Conley, and to some extent, Jaden McDaniels got better and better at it, the more that Gobert can be fed the low-hanging fruit. I mean, Gobert needs to be rewarded for his patience.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, and this I specifically addressed this issue with Finch in I guess what'll be the part 2 of the interview. I said, when you're talking about Ant Gobert interactions, you have a situation where one guy is limited athletically and one guy is limited experientially. So you have this dual challenge of these things. And Ant's experience will help. But the fact of the matter is, Gobert finishes better when he can see the ball and when it's coming. I mean, D'Lo, would pull his long hair out when he saw the, D'Lo would give him a no-look pass. Don't give Rudy Gobert no-look passes. I mean, he just doesn't have the athleticism to eye-hand coordinate and then coordinate his appendages to get the ball in the hoop. It just isn't that way. In fact, some of the best lobs with Gobert were fake shots by Kyle Anderson, where he had the ball in his hand like Don Nelson used to shoot fouls and basically push it up toward the rim. Right. And sometimes it looked like a shot, but most of the time it was a lob. And Gobert loved that stuff. Mm-hmm. And Conley got used to basically showing him the ball on the dribble, And these are things you do have to. And that's why when Finch talks about 4 high users, Gobert is a high usage guy because it requires a lot of enabling, and that is usage too. And so, Ant, by his sheer athleticism, will create situations where even Ant's lesser capability of delivering will be enough if everything is executed properly. But it also is important to have other people. And I'm not a big believer in making Rudy Gobert getting fed, even in the top 3 priorities of the Wolves offense. I mean, I think the more you focus on getting Gobert off, the more you're hurting yourself. That's just my bias.
But it depends.
I know.
Yeah, I'm 1,000% with you. That means if we're talking about post-ups. But using Gobert as a threat in the pick and roll is something that benefits Rudy as it gets him some touches and some engagement and all that too. But that's what we're talking about when you say Rudy has all this gravity. Like you hit Rudy on one of those, 2 of those in a quarter, and the next 4 times Ant gets downhill to the basket, it's way cleaner. The benefit isn't actually for Rudy. It's for the others and for KAT too. Like it's not all just pick and roll. It's also having KAT's ability to, have his pump and go game, which Finch said to you is like, that is the main thing we need to get back with KAT. It's having a more open lane. If Rudy's man has to respect him a little bit more, always be touched up with him, then that guy can't come and block off the rim if it's Porzingis, Jared Allen, whoever it might be, and do that. So I think you do need to get Rudy involved.
I will concede that a chunk of Gobert's issues last year were his teammates not knowing how to use him. I would also argue that Gobert was spoiled rotten in that regard in Utah, so that he got accustomed to being catered. I mean, the ball was on a platter to him most of the time.
Right.
And I would just like to point out, in prep for the Finch interview, it just is this situation where Gobert's numbers in terms of field goal percentage and volume are really good on synergy. But suddenly what isn't very good is points per play. Now, why is that? It's because he does not finish very well. Let me see if I can find it. Gobert Gobert had the third most cutting possessions, but he was 110th in points per play because he was 159th in field goal percentage finishing on cuts.
That's just fumbles.
Huh?
That's
exactly. Well, that's certainly part of it. He was 5th in putback possessions, but 167th in putback points because his field goal percentage was 161st.
What we're saying is, if when Rudy has it there,
talk about low-hanging fruit. Now, either that fruit is already rotten, or that is something with just a little bit of tweaking. Even if you get those numbers, what I am saying though is, until we're better than 150th in points per possession, let's not be 5th in the amount of possessions that takes.
The dream.
And let me put it in context, just to be fair to Gobert. The schemes we're talking about, putbacks and cuts by a big, do result in huge field goal percentages. So being 150th in field goal percentage would still be like being 5th in spot ups or something. I mean, it isn't, but it is important to note that it is not the most efficient way. It's less efficient than it looks because Gobert is clumsy.
Well, it's when Rudy gets a touch within, let's call it 8 feet of the basket, and it's a situation that it can't be dunked.
Right.
One of two things have to happen. The pass to him you decide we are not doing that pass, or we are minimizing that as much as reasonably possible, or Rudy has to develop a push shot.
Right.
Like I always say the little Rashawn Holmes little push shot sort of thing.
Right.
I remember Jakob Poeltl. I remember just recognizing him starting.
Right. All of a sudden, right.
It's those. I mean, it's literally developing that sort of skill that Rudy does not yet have. Right. If he can have that changes all those numbers completely. It boosts his usage,
right?
Because now you're more comfortable giving him the ball in those sort of spots. But when it's catch there, it's double pivot, it's fade, it's maybe start dribbling, which is dribbling when it doesn't matter who you are within 8 feet of the basket. That's going to get poked away often, particularly if you're 7'2". It's going to happen. I mean, decisive dunk, decisive put shot. Like that needs to be what the Rudy catches are, and the guys need to put them in place to do that. I mean, there was that like 1 week where there's a bunch of video clips floating around of Rudy taking threes in practice for France, or he made the one in the World Cup game.
Right.
What I was thinking about was like, man, if I'm power ranking skill sets to add, that's not on the top of my list. The top of my list is a little 6-foot push shot, hook shot, something like that can quickly and decisively happen, because if he catches the ball, he's in, like you said, it's in such a high value position to put it in, and putting it in, seeing it go in more. If Ant sees that, he's going to do it more often, man. I was just watching back the pick and roll clips from the game 5 against the Nuggets. And over the course of that game, Ant's faith in giving Rudy the ball in those spots just decreased.
And you know what? I'm okay with that. I mean, I know it's not the right way to say it, but I think
that is right. That is right. I'm with
the sure thing. They need, until and unless Rudy, at the age of 31, demonstrates that the old dog has got a nice new trick, I would say that you make sure of the sure thing. But when it comes to Ant, I just feel like there needs to be a recognition that Gobert, the Wolves did very well when Jared Vanderbilt was in that dunker spot. And part of that was because Vanderbilt was also an offensive rebounding hound and was faster, could cover more ground on the glass than Rudy can. But you can make it work. Gobert doesn't have to be the force he was in Utah to be either a great decoy or a more efficient Vando, of just being able to go. If you get 2 late clock lobs, or whatever you want to call them, to Rudy a night, and you run him on cuts and pick and rolls conventionally half the time you did last season, I think that's a good mix, especially if KAT is going to be healthy and on the floor, and Ant is going to be Ant even more than he was last year. See, I think that, and this, my bias comes through on Gobert quite a bit, and will be probably until I'm proven to be wrong, which is certainly possible. I acknowledge all that. But I think editing down Gobert on offense is one of the ways the Wolves get better this year.
Yeah. Oh, I hope it doesn't come up that I'm pushing back on that.
No, I know. But I mean, I
know it's not going to be 0. Like,
right. Yeah, you're right.
Whatever the percentage of the usage is that Rudy gets, it's how do we make that look more like Utah and less like last season? That's true. That's ultimately the question. If you're cool with it, you want to hit on the staggering the bigs thing?
By all means, yeah.
Let's so part 1 was kind of the KAT-Gobert pairing again,
and an intro.
Yeah.
I only had 2,000 words. Well, I mean, what do you want, man?
I was proud of you.
2,000 words.
It's over at MinnPost. For all of this will be, of course, and it's called 101 with Chris Finch. Look that up. We're recording this on Thursday. Only part 1's up, but by Friday, part 2 will be up. You sent me,
and then 2 or 3 more parts next week.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think maybe we'll find a time for the two of us to because I haven't even read those yet. So I'm curious.
Oh yeah, we read more of those. This is it's loaded stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's low. I've read 2 parts, and I have my Google Doc here has many bullet points. But so much of parts 1 and 2 are about the bigs pairing, how that relates to Ant, and structure.
Right, because those are if you're going into the season, the way I began the interview is the consensus feeling among Wolves fans, in my opinion, which is born in part from my bias, of course, but is that you synergize KAT and Rudy without impeding Ant's ascendance. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to sum up what the Wolves need to do in a sentence,
that's the North
this year. That's pretty obvious. Mm-hmm. And Finch agreed, and he said that's the mission. It's got to be tied into winning.
Right.
Surprise, surprise. But I mean,
there's other stuff too, though.
Those are what most of the first 2 parts are, mm-hmm. except that we do get in at the end of part 2 into some of the rotation things.
Yeah, and just it's specifically kind of about the bigs, which is another maybe not top line question of this, but how the rotation works. Finch said again, I think we might have to stagger them. What that looks like exactly, I'm not sure in terms of rotation. It's a concession on his part by the organization's view that
a smart one, but that it was a concession they made when they signed Naz.
Exactly. Boom. And that's what they're going to need to figure out. Like we said, we talked about a lot. What does it look like? Phase 1 which is both of the bigs on the floor. What does it look like with just KAT on the floor? What does it look like with just Rudy on the floor? And then the next wrinkle to that is, of those latter two, the just KAT or the just Rudy, how do Kyle or Naz or Naz, maybe both of them at the same time,
Strongly
fit
implied.
in with just KAT or just Rudy? And that is one of those maybe kind of nerdy in the weed ideas.
Yeah.
But man, I personally believe how they figure that out is going to be a really defining tertiary thing for this team. And it's really Naz and Kyle specific in a way. We really like, there was Naz week. We say Naz week all the time, but it was 1 week. It was 3 games where they were all back and Naz was playing. It looked like it worked. Then he breaks his wrist. How duplicable is that? How can you get to that, consistently with Naz next to KAT or Naz next to Rudy, which is Naz has played a surprisingly small percentage of his career minutes at power forward over 4 seasons. Right. And then the other one that whenever I start getting into the weeds, I start thinking about this is I think about Kyle and moving to the 3 and what that is going to look like. I've been kind of I've thought about texting you about this over the course of time, but figure we talk about am I wrong to be pretty concerned that by sliding Kyle to the 3, you might lose a lot of what made him so invaluable last season when he played, I think it's 89% of his minutes at the 4?
Well, I think that Finch sees him as a point guard. And I mean, he basically, we talked about Kyle and what I said, I mean, the lead up, and this may be in part 3 or whatever, but essentially I said, you've said on numerous occasions to me and other people that Kyle Anderson saved our season last year. I mean, that's become a kind of a frequent quote from Chris Finch. Yeah. And then another thing he said to JJ Redick, thank you, before I did this interview, and I don't watch podcasts, which is kind of ironic. I know. But he said to Redick, he almost has to be out there in crunch time because he's our best decision maker. Mm-hmm. I mean, so those are 2 heavy statements. Right. So I asked him, I mean, in part 3, I said, this is a guy that you adore, and can he have the same impact this year as he had last year, and is that a good thing if he does? Right. And the answer was kind of I still love the guy, and it'll probably but I think it was kind of a begrudging, it won't be as much of an impact, but he is planning on like when I said, how are Kyle and Ant going to figure it out? Because they'll be on the floor a lot together, I think, because they'll be in that tertiary second unit, I think, as real key cogs to that. And he said that Ant has to understand that almost nobody can enable Ant on the half court like Kyle can. And so, and he also said that Kyle is the Rudy whisperer, and he wants to keep that, obviously, but he said, and his numbers are good with KAT too. And he wants Kyle to be, enabling KAT a lot. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, I didn't get into that any further. That's where I think KAT's going to talk himself into deferring to Ant, I think, quite a bit. And he's going to like the idea of the 2 big synergy if and when it happens with Rudy. But Kyle may be a little bit more of a rival in that respect, because KAT fashions himself as, a Jokic-like big man who can sling the ball and do a lot of things. And Finch is going to want Kyle to be setting up the offense, especially at the free throw line, when KAT is on the floor. And right. KAT KAT loves to set things up at the free throw line.
It's just interesting to think about, right? And I'm not saying this won't work.
Right.
It's interesting to think about Kyle operating from the nail with the ball in his hands with two other bigs on the floor. That's
and if one of those other bigs is Naz,
then
it might work out better.
Mm-hmm.
And if the other big, put it this way, if it's Rudy, KAT, and Kyle, I don't like that as much as I like KAT, Naz, and Kyle.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I pulled up on the screen here, and this is like probably part of this is me overreacting to some of these numbers. But I go back and I knew this within Memphis. Like Kyle had, partially he had injuries and stuff like that, but he had really up and down years in his 4 years in Memphis. And what you'd see happen was his first 2 years in Memphis, and he's playing 3/4 of his minutes at small forward, and at small forward pretty much throughout his time, the team's effectiveness was significantly worse when he was at small forward versus power forward. Here you see 19-20 minus 6.4 when he's at small forward, plus 7.3 when he's at power forward. It's a huge difference. And so you saw them change in his final 2 years there was they switched him to a power forward, 82% of his minutes at power forward, and the same trend continued. Team was significantly better with Kyle playing the 4 than when he was playing small forward. Again, that carries over into to Minnesota. They play almost 90% of his minutes at power forward. Hardly anything else. And I know that his positions distinctions are a little weird because he initiates a lot too. But he was a power forward in the sense that he was on the floor with only one other true big. He is going to be on the floor with two other true bigs at times this season. And that's going to make him a small forward, right? And when that happened with Valanciunas and Jackson Jr. in Memphis, it was significantly worse than it was when he was the second big out there as well. I might be kind of overrating.
No, but that is an excellent point. I wish I had dug it up and asked Finch. If I had seen those numbers, I would have asked Finch. I know we like to keep we like to talk about things, but we also like to operate on our own so that we can come into podcasts, with our own set of self-derived things. But that is a very interesting, and I will tell you that it is in my mind. The reason I asked Finch what I asked him was because I do not believe Kyle Anderson can be as effective this year as he was last year. Partly because he filled a void that was a natural fill for him. And you are not going to dramatically diminish KAT's role in that power forward slot of kind of do everything flexibility just because he saved your season and is the best decision maker in crunch time. I mean, unfortunately, that's not the way it works. Not for nothing, Kyle is playing in a contract year too. So it's all going to be kind of fascinating because KAT's here for the next 5 years and Jade McDaniels will be signed. I'm very confident. There just isn't places for Kyle Anderson to be the big splash he was last year. I just don't see it.
That's a good point. I haven't really thought about it in the context of is Kyle a long-term part of this plan here, right? So maybe
the fact that Finch loves him so much is really the only reason that's in doubt.
Yeah. Well, it is in doubt. Yeah, because everything else puts it in doubt. You have a million different bigs on your roster. Kyle's better has historically been better as a big than a wing. But then also there's the cap factor, right? I kind of need to familiarize my mind with that. But as I remember the cap situation, it's like
really hard to sign him, even if you want to.
It's kind of like maybe best case you get back one of Conley or Anderson a year from now.
Yeah.
And even
then, I think they both are incredibly important, but they're almost like when you hire a consultant to come in and they just do a great job reshaping your company, and then it's time for them to go. I mean, it unfortunately.
See, with that makes more sense based on age.
And it also makes more sense if, in fact, if we go macro. I mean, micro this season, I'm hoping Kyle Anderson is almost as important as he was last year. And I know that Mike Conley will be vital to what goes on this year. But I also think macro, when we're talking 2026, we're talking about whether or not KAT has accepted the fact that that Ant is finished third in the MVP voting or something. It's going to be that, and then you're going to have guys like Nah and Jaden McDaniels and Naz Reid. You're going to have a different kind of team. If you notice the enthusiasm, there's a different kind of enthusiasm in Ant's voice when he talks about him, Jaden, and Naz. It's like the young mafia, well, we're going to come in and just kick ass and take names on people. He regards those two guys as like his running buddies, and that is a wonderful place to be if you're a Minnesota Timberwolf, to be one of the guys that the person who stirs the drink regards you as one of the ingredients in the glass.
It's a good place to be if you're Jaden McDaniels and in a contract negotiation right now.
Man, I mean, later on in this, the Jaden McDaniels discussions, part of it is Jaden McDaniels. The more you dive into the numbers, Jaden McDaniels had a phenomenally good year last year. Oh my God. I mean, and Finch is aware of it. And Finch also knows, you talked about they got to find ways to get more usage. And Finch says, no, it just can't happen. It can't happen. It can't happen. On the other hand, he is aware of everything he does, and he wants to, another teaser, I can say, whatever you want to call it. I asked him point blank whether having Knob be such a good on-ball defender can get Jaden off the ball more, and he said yes. So, there will be some of that. And we talked about the ifs and whens of following and everything. And
sure.
But he also just talked about all the things that Jaden McDaniels does at both ends of the court. It's, and at one point I do say, this is in, I think, the end of part 3. He's lauding about, all these things about McDaniels. I said, and he doesn't have a contract. And Finch snorts and says he'll have a contract.
There we go. That's a good little piece there, Britt. Well, okay, we need to we definitely need to do another episode on this. I'm excited to read the parts that I haven't read of this. There's even some other things I have in my notes that we didn't get to today. So me and Britt will do another one of these sometime next week. I really do recommend going over to MinnPost to read this. This is a gem in every year in preseason Wolves content. It is the article that stirred up the Jaden McDaniels Scottie Pippen comparison a few years ago. Finch quote said that to you in this. This is just loaded with stuff. I think particularly for somebody like myself who really likes to picture how a team will look. We're really fortunate to have a coach that will discuss it.
Exactly. That's the thing. I mean, I really want to emphasize this. As I mentioned at the top of this podcast, I've done this with a lot of people. And I've heard you were on with him in June. You know what it's like. JJ Redick knows what it's like. Anybody with half a brain that isn't wanting to talk to Chris Finch about the Minnesota Timberwolves. I mean, the guy is just so easy. He doesn't duck questions. Mm-hmm. I can tell sometimes, when I was listening back, transcribing the interview, the flaws in some of the ways I was phrasing things, he understood what I was talking about, even if I wasn't, I mean, he makes you look smarter than you are. It's just, it's a joy to talk to him. And the fact that I did kind of challenge him at the end of, in the very end of the interview with two things that it was interesting to see him, dander get up a little, just about, was the Gobert trade on balance a good thing? And then also, was the team not held accountable enough for its lack of discipline last year?
Interesting.
Those are two things that I figured, we'd had all this goodwill, we might as well smear it. But I mean, just those are two things that I think about, and it was only fair to ask them and give.
It's what a lot of people think about, and again, I know it's just we're just fawning over it, but these, in my opinion, these are important questions to answer or topics to dig into if you want to get your fan base, that X percentage of it is just out on it because the trade happened and because of how it looked last year. I think it's smart PR wise, right? To have conversations that peel back why it could be better, and to each their own subjectively decide how complicated or difficult or how much you believe that's going to be. At least the coach is talking about, and will continue to talk about at Media Day next week through training camp. He will openly talk about it because we need to know about it, right? We need this fan base needs something more to believe in from this team, I think, than what they saw on paper or in the salary cap or in the draft picks or whatever it might be. And I think Finch is doing a good job.
And some guys like to talk about it. I mean, Tom Thibodeau does not.
Yeah, right.
Chris Finch does. It's just one of those things.
Yeah. MinnPost.com article is titled "1-on-1" with Chris Finch. You'll be able to find that. Also, Britt wanted to mention that you will be at MinnPost Festival 2023 this Saturday, 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. September 23rd.
Saturday. It's Saturday afternoon. To be honest with you, I have never been there. I'm going to have to look it up. And
it's
Google
the 1893 historic Grain Belt office. If you just if you Google MinnPost Festival 2023, you can sign up for a free ticket. But as I understand it,
and there's a lot of other stuff going on. It isn't just. I'm one of like many things that are going on. MinnPost staffers and a lot of people from around the community. Samantha Bee is giving a keynote, and Tim Walz is going to be there to be interviewed, the governor of Minnesota. There's all kinds of stuff. MinnPost. One of the things I like about being associated with MinnPost is it's a good place to get a lot of different kinds of information. And to be honest with you, sports is kind of not one of their top priorities. And to the extent that we rub each other the wrong way, sometimes it's because of that. But I do like the idea of, when I go out on the 14th to Falling Knife, it's the same way. I love to meet people in public and just shoot the shit about basketball and Timberwolves in general. And so if you want to come out, the format will be similar to my Zooms that I did during the course of the season, MinnPost Zooms, where people just basically ask me questions, and feel free to come up after or before that if I'm around. I don't know if I don't get lost getting there, and at 1:30, and then I'll probably stick around for a little while afterwards if people don't get a chance to ask me questions or would rather do it one-on-one. I'll be there, so feel free to come by.
Yeah, I think I'm going to come through. Again, you do need to get a ticket, as I understand it.
And they're free, apparently. Who knows why all that happens, but
I don't know. We put it out there, though. That's this Saturday. Again, a lot more Wolves stuff to come. Media Day is early because the Wolves are going to Abu Dhabi.
They've announced it now, September 28th.
September 28th will be Media Day a week from today, and then that just gets stuff going. So we'll start having more pods, not just me and Britt, but Kyle and Kyle's going to be in town for Media Day. We're going to be doing some stuff next week. A couple other guests as well, Chris and Jace, all the normal names and faces. So Vikings suck, right? So let's let's move over to the Wolves. Britt, thank you for doing this. As always, you guys can follow Britt on Twitter. That might be a fast route to Britt's articles with Finch that'll be coming out over the course of the next week. Again, I really do recommend listening or reading those. Again, follow Britt on Twitter at Britt Robson. Britt, let's do this again next week sometime.
Sounds good.
All right. Until then, he's Britt. Follow him on Twitter at Britt Robson. I'm Dane. Peace out.